The bedroom door slammed so hard the entire mansion shook, and Marcus stumbled out into the hallway, his shirt half-buttoned, his face twisted in humiliation and rage. "You're impossible!" He screamed back toward the room, his voice cracking with frustration that echoed through the marble corridors of the Montgomery estate. Inside, Simone Montgomery sat on the edge of a king-size bed, wrapped in silk sheets, staring at nothing with eyes that held neither satisfaction nor regret, just emptiness. Another man, another failure, another night where money bought her company but couldn't buy what she truly craved. The clock on her nightstand read 2:47 a.m., and somewhere in the distance she could hear Marcus's car tearing down the gravel driveway, spitting rocks and anger into the night. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She just sat there in the massive bedroom of her dead father's mansion, surrounded by luxury that cost more than most people in Pinewood, Georgia would see in a lifetime, feeling absolutely nothing. If you ever felt like no matter what you have, something essential is always missing, then stay with me because this story will shake you to your core. This is the story of the billionaire's daughter no man in the entire town could satisfy, and the shocking truth behind her impossible standards that would tear this small southern community apart. Hit that subscribe button right now because what you're about to hear will change how you see everything. Marcus wasn't the first man to leave Simone's bed in fury, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. He was number 17. To be exact, 17 men in 2 years since Simone had returned to Pinewood after her father's death left her the wealthiest woman in 3 counties. The town of 4,200 people had never seen anything like Simone Montgomery. She drove a candy-red Mercedes through streets where most folks still drove pickup trucks covered in mud and memories. She wore designer dresses to the Piggly Wiggly where everyone else wore jeans and work boots. Her natural hair was styled in ways that made the older church ladies whisper about appropriateness, and her confidence made men stumble over their words and their feet. And she had a reputation that made the church ladies clutch their pearls and the men whisper in barbershops and bars with voices full of bravado and lies. They said she went through men like tissue paper, using them up and throwing them away without a second thought. They said she was insatiable, impossible to please, maybe even cursed by whatever demons rich people accumulated with their money. They said no man in the entire town could satisfy the billionaire's daughter's urge, and that she'd broken more hearts and egos than anyone could count on both hands. What they didn't know, what nobody in Pinewood knew, was that Simone wasn't looking for satisfaction in the bedroom at all. The whispers started the morning after her 3rd failed relationship became public knowledge, and they never stopped. Simone had walked into Rose's diner for breakfast on a Tuesday, and the entire restaurant fell silent like someone had pulled the plug on all sound. 40 pairs of eyes followed her from the door to a corner booth, tracking her movement like she was a celebrity or a criminal or something in between. The moment she sat down, the whispers exploded like wildfire, spreading from table to table with the speed of small-town gossip that had nothing better to do than destroy reputations before lunch. "That's her," old Mrs. Patterson hissed to her daughter, her voice loud enough for half the diner to hear. "The one who sent David Miller packing after just 2 weeks. That boy looked like he'd been through a war when I saw him at church. Wouldn't even make eye contact with anybody." Her daughter nodded eagerly, cutting her eyes toward Simone with a kind of judgment that only comes from people who've never lived through what they are judging. "I heard she's impossible to please, Mama. My cousin Jerome dated her last month, and he said no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, she just lay there looking bored, checking her phone sometimes. Said it destroyed his confidence so bad he can't even look at women anymore." Simone heard every single word. She always did. In a town this small, privacy was a fairy tale people told themselves, and a business had become everyone's entertainment, their favorite show to discuss over coffee and eggs. What Pinewood didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly understand with their small-town minds and smaller imaginations, was that Simone's dissatisfaction had absolutely nothing to do with the physical performance of the men she brought into her bed. It had everything to do with a hollowness that had lived inside her chest since she was 7 years old, standing in a black dress at her mother's funeral, watching them lower the casket into the ground while her father stood beside her like a statue, not crying, not holding her hand, just staring straight ahead like he was already back at work in his mind. That hollowness had grown with every birthday party her father missed, Every school play where she searched the audience for his face and found an empty seat. Every Christmas morning where she opened expensive gifts alone while he took business calls in his study. Her father, Robert Montgomery, had built his fortune in real estate and manufacturing, buying up half of Georgia One property at a time, and he'd given Simone everything money could buy: the best private schools where she was the only black girl in most of her classes, the finest clothes that she wore to impress nobody, trips to Paris and Tokyo and Dubai where she took photos alone. But he'd never given her his time. He'd never given her his presence. He'd never once asked her what she was afraid of in the dark. So Simone had learned to fill the void her mother's death and her father's absence had carved into her soul with other things: attention from men who wanted her body, admiration from women who envied her money, the temporary warmth of bodies next to haze in the dark that disappeared by morning. She'd learned that wealth could buy companionship but not connection, that her beauty could attract men but not keep them once they realized she was searching for something they didn't have and couldn't give. No luxury ever filled the emptiness. No man ever satisfied the urge that wasn't about sex at all but about being seen, being known, being held by someone who stayed. And now, at 28 years old, she was back in Pinewood, the town where she'd grown up lonely in a mansion, surrounded by every material thing a child could want but starving for the one thing money couldn't buy: love that didn't come with conditions or expiration dates. Marcus appeared in the doorway of Rosie's diner 30 minutes after Simone sat down, his eyes wild and searching until they landed on her like missiles finding their target. He stormed toward her table with fists clenched, and every conversation in the diner stopped mid-sentence. "You owe me an explanation. Simone!" he shouted, loud enough for God and everybody to hear. "You owe me something after wasting 2 months of my life." Simone looked up slowly, her face expressionless, and said the words that would set this entire town on fire. "I don't owe you anything, Marcus. But maybe you should ask yourself why no man in this entire town can satisfy me." The diner erupted, and that's when everything changed. The news spread through Pinewood like a plague, faster than any virus, more destructive than any storm. By noon, every barbershop, beauty salon, church office, and grocery store checkout line was buzzing with the same story. Simone Montgomery had publicly humiliated Marcus Johnson in front of half the town, and her words, "No man in this entire town can satisfy me," had become a declaration of war. Men who'd never even spoken to Simone suddenly had opinions about her character, her morals, her father's money making her think she was better than everybody else. Women who'd smiled in her face at the post office now crossed the street to avoid her, whispering about karma and comeuppance and how pride always comes before a fall. But what nobody expected was for Simone to double down. She didn't apologize. She didn't hide. Instead, she posted a photo on Instagram that same afternoon, her in a red dress that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, standing in front of a Mercedes with a caption, "Still waiting for a real man in Pinewood. Applications open." If you think this story can't get more explosive, stay tuned because what happens next will leave you speechless. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on because this drama is just getting started, and you won't want to miss a single moment of what's coming. Marcus Johnson sat in his mama's kitchen that afternoon, his head in his hands, his pride shattered into a million pieces he didn't know how to put back together. His mother, Diane, stood at the stove making sweet tea, her lips pressed into a thin line of disappointment that had nothing to do with the tea and everything to do with her son's poor choices. "I told you to leave that girl alone," Diane said without turning around, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy fulfilled. "I told you money like haze don't mix with regular folks like us. But you wouldn't listen. None of your boys ever listen." Marcus looked up, his eyes red from anger more than sadness. "Mama, I tried everything. I bought her flowers every week even though I had to work overtime to afford them. I took her to every restaurant within 50 miles. I learned to like that fancy wine she drinks that tastes like vinegar. And she never even tried. Mama. It's like she wasn't even there when we were together." Diane finally turned around, and the look on her face was something between pity and frustration. "Baby, when are you gonna understand? That girl ain't looking for flowers or fancy dinners. She's looking for something none of y'all have figured out how to give her. And until somebody does, she's gonna keep breaking hearts and collecting enemies in this town." Marcus slammed his fist on the table. "Then what does she want? What could the billionaire's daughter possibly need that money can't buy?" The answer to that question was sitting in a lawyer's office 15 miles outside Pinewood, hidden in documents that hadn't been opened since Robert Montgomery's death 2 years ago. Simone had made an appointment with Gerald Hutchinson, her father's longtime attorney, not because she needed legal advice, but because she needed answers to questions that had haunted her since she was a child. Gerald was a black man in his 60s who'd known Simone since she was in diapers, who'd watched her grow up in that mansion with everything except what mattered most. He sat across from her now in his modest office, a folder thick with papers resting between them like a barrier or a bridge. She couldn't tell which. "Simone, are you sure you want to see these?" Gerald asked, his voice gentle but grave. "Your father made me promise not to share them unless you specifically asked. He said it might hurt you more than help you." Simone leaned forward, her designer purse sliding off her lap and hitting the floor. Ignored. "Mr. Hutchinson, I've spent my entire life hurting from what I didn't know. My father never talked about my mother except to say she was gone. He never talked about why he worked so much, why he couldn't look at me sometimes without his eyes going dark. I need to know. I need to understand why I'm the way I am." Gerald nodded slowly and opened the folder. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all written in her mother's handwriting, all addressed to Simone, all dated for birthdays and Christmases and graduations that would come after her mother was already gone. "Your mother was sick for 2 years before she died," Gerald began, his voice thick with emotion he'd held for decades. "Breast cancer. She and your father decided not to tell you because you were so young, and they wanted to protect you from the fear. But your mother knew she was dying, Simone, and she spent every moment she had strength writing you these letters, one for every important moment of your life she knew she'd miss. She wrote about love, about heartbreak, about finding yourself when you feel lost. She wrote about the mistakes you made, the lessons she learned, the dreams she had for you." Gerald pushed the folder across the desk, and Simone's hands trembled as she reached for it. "Your father kept these locked away because reading them destroyed him. Every time he looked at you, he saw her. Every time he heard you laugh, he heard her laugh. And he couldn't handle it, baby girl. So he buried himself in work, and he buried these letters in a safe, and he tried to forget that love could hurt this much. But he never stopped loving you. He just didn't know how to show it without falling apart." Simone opened the first letter, and her mother's words reached across the grave. "My dearest Simone, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, but I need you to know something important. Being loved isn't about what people can give you materially. It's about being seen for who you are, even in your darkest moments, and being held anyway." Simone left Gerald's office 3 hours later with a box full of letters and a heart full of answers she wasn't sure she wanted. The sun was setting over Pinewood as she drove back through town, and for the first time in years, she understood that her impossible standards, her endless dissatisfaction, her hunger that no man could fill, it wasn't about sex at all. It was about searching for the kind of unconditional love her mother had given her and her father had been too broken to continue after she died. The men she'd brought into her bed weren't failing because they couldn't perform physically. They were failing because they were trying to fill a void that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with a 7-year-old girl who watched her mother die and her father disappear into grief disguised as ambition. As Simone pulled into her driveway, she saw someone waiting on her porch. It was Isaiah Bennett, the quietest man in Pinewood, a carpenter who'd grown up 2 streets over from her mansion but might as well have lived in another universe. He stood when he saw her car, his work clothes dusty, his hands shoved in his pockets, his dark skin gleaming in the porch light. "Miss Montgomery," he called out as she approached. "I know you don't know me, but I need to tell you something. Something everybody in this town is getting wrong about you." Simone stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, exhausted and emotionally raw, clutching the box of her mother's letters. "And what would that be, Mr. Bennett?" Isaiah looked her dead in the eyes and said the words that would change everything. "You're not impossible to satisfy. This town is just impossible to see what you really need. And I think I know what that is." Simone should have walked away, should have told Isaiah Bennett to mind his business like she'd told every other man in Pinewood who thought they had her figured out. But something in his eyes stopped her, not desire, not arrogance, not the cocky certainty that had dripped from every other man who'd approached her. Isaiah looked at her like he was reading a book written in a language only he understood, and for the first time in 2 years, Simone felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with her soul. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut, defensive walls shooting up like steel barriers. Isaiah didn't flinch. He stepped down from the porch slowly, keeping his distance, his hands still in his pockets like he was approaching a wounded animal. "I know you came back to Pinewood 2 years ago after your father died, and you've been trying to feel something empty inside you ever since," he said quietly. "I know every man in this town thinks the problem is him not being man enough, but the real problem is nobody's asking what you're actually searching for. If you're wondering how this conversation is about to explode into something nobody saw coming, then drop a like right now and keep watching, because what Isaiah says next will flip this entire story on its head. And trust me, you need to hear every single word of this." The box of letters slipped from Simone's hands and hit the ground, spilling envelopes across the porch steps like fallen leaves. Isaiah bent down immediately to help gather them, and that's when he saw the handwriting, elegant, feminine, familiar somehow though he'd never seen it before. "These from your mamma?" he asked softly, handing her a stack. Simone snatched them back, her eyes blazing with something between fury and tears. "How dare you? You don't get to talk about her. You don't get to come to my house and psychoanalyze me like you're some kind of therapist when you're just a carpenter who probably heard the gossip and wants to see if you can be the one to satisfy the billionaire's daughter." The words came out like venom, designed to hurt, designed to push him away before he could get close enough to matter. But Isaiah didn't move. He stood there in the growing darkness, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of his own pain. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said, and the words landed like bombs in the space between them. "Cancer. We were married 2 years, and I spent every day of those 2 years watching her fade away, watching her fight, watching her try to smile through pain that would have broken most people on day one. And when she died, I buried myself in work just like your father did. I built houses and cabinets and furniture until my hands bled, because working meant I didn't have to feel. So yeah, Miss Montgomery, I do know something about trying to fill an empty space with anything except what actually belongs there." Simone felt her armor cracking, felt the walls she'd built so carefully starting to crumble under the weight of his honesty. She sat down on the porch steps, suddenly exhausted, and Isaiah sat beside her, not too close, respectful of her space, but present in a way that felt different from every other man who'd tried to claim territory in her life. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Isaiah looked up at the stars starting to appear in the Georgia sky, and when he answered, it wasn't what she expected. "I don't want anything from you, Simone, but I want to tell you something that might save you years of pain. Those men you've been with, Marcus, David, Jerome, all of them, they came to you wanting to take something. They wanted to say they'd been with the richest woman in town. They wanted to prove they could satisfy you so they could brag about it in bars. They wanted access to your money, your status, your world. But they never wanted to know you. They never asked what you lost when your mama died. They never wondered why a woman with everything still looked so lonely." Simone turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw something she'd miss in every other man's eyes, genuine concern without expectation, understanding without agenda. "And you're different?" she asked, skepticism still thick in her voice. Isaiah smiled sadly. "I'm not here to satisfy any urge, Simone. I'm here because I know what it's like to be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. And I'm here to tell you that what you're looking for isn't in anybody's bed." What happened next will become the most talked-about scandal in Pinewood's history, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Isaiah stood up, pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, and handed it to Simone. It was an address, a house on the black side of town where the streets weren't paved and the houses weren't mansions. "Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. There's a grief support group that meets at the community center. People who've lost parents, spouses, children, people who understand that money can't buy your way out of pain. I think you should come." Simone stared at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. "A support group? You came to my house to invite me to a support group." Isaiah shrugged. "I came to your house to tell you that no man in this entire town can satisfy your urge because what you're hungry for isn't sex, Simone. It's connection. It's being seen for who you are under all that armor you wear. It's grieving your mama properly instead of trying to fuck the pain away." The words were harsh but true, and they hit Simone like a physical blow. "And if I don't come?" she asked, defensive again. Isaiah was already walking toward his truck, but he turned back with a look that was almost pitying. "Then you'll keep collecting lovers and enemies until this town destroys you, or you destroy yourself. Your choice." He climbed into his beat-up Ford and drove away, leaving Simone sitting on her porch with her mother's letters and a choice she never thought she'd have to make. Inside the house, Simone's phone was exploding with notifications. The Instagram post she'd made had gone viral, not just in Pinewood but across the entire state. Bloggers were writing think pieces about entitled rich women. Men's rights groups were using her as an example of female arrogance. Local news stations were calling her publicists, who she didn't have, asking for interviews. And in Pinewood itself, the rage was reaching a boiling point. A group of men who'd been rejected by Simone or who simply hated what she represented had started organizing. They called themselves the Pinewood Brotherhood, and their mission was simple: expose Simone Montgomery for the fraud she was, prove that her father's money came from exploiting black folks in the community, and run her out of town before she could destroy any more men's lives. Their leader was Marcus Johnson, his humiliation transformed into righteous anger, his hurt calcified into hate. They planned to protest outside her mansion, to boycott any business that served her, to make her life in Pinewood so miserable she'd have no choice but to leave. But they didn't know about the letters. They didn't know about Isaiah. And they didn't know that Simone Montgomery was about to make a decision that would expose every single one of them for the cowards they really were. As Simone sat reading her mother's first letter by porchlight, tears streaming down her face, she heard cars pulling up to her gate, at least a dozen of them, engines rumbling, voices shouting. The Pinewood Brotherhood had arrived, and they wanted blood. The question was, would Simone fight back, or would she finally break? Simone didn't run inside and call the police like they expected. She didn't hide behind her mansion walls or her father's money like the woman they convinced themselves she was. Instead, she stood up slowly, wiped a tear from her face, and walked down her driveway toward the iron gates where a dozen pickup trucks idled with their headlights blazing like spotlights on a stage she never auditioned for. Marcus stood at the front of the group, a megaphone in his hand and rage in his eyes, surrounded by men whose faces she recognized from the diner, the gas station, the bank, men who'd smiled at her father's funeral and whispered about her inheritance before his body was even cold. "There she is," Marcus shouted through the megaphone, his voice distorted and ugly. "The woman who thinks she's too good for every man in this town. The woman who uses people up and throws them away like trash." The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices blending into a roar of masculine hurt and entitlement. But Simone kept walking until she stood just inside her gate, separated from the mob by iron bars in a distance that felt both enormous and paper-thin. If you think you know how this confrontation is going to end, think again. Hit that subscribe button, because what Simone does next will change everything you thought you knew about strength, vulnerability, and what it really means to stand up for yourself. You want to know why no man in this entire town can satisfy me. Simone called out, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife through butter. The crowd quieted slightly, curiosity mixing with their anger. "It's not because you're not man enough. It's not because I'm too picky or too broken or too anything." She pulled her mother's first letter from her pocket, the paper trembling in her hand but her voice steady. "It's because every single one of you came to me wanting something, my money, my status, bragging rights at the bar. But not one of you ever asked me what I needed. Not one of you ever wondered why a woman with everything still feels empty inside." Marcus laughed, cruel and mocking. "Oh, here we go. Poor little rich girl act. You think your sad story changes what you did to me? To David? To Jerome? You humiliated us. Simone, you made us feel like we weren't enough. Simone nodded slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer but somehow stronger. You're right. I did make you feel that way, and I'm sorry for that. But you know what none of you ever stopped to consider? That maybe I was looking for someone who could see past the money and the body and the attitude to the scared little girl underneath who's been trying to fill the hole her mama's death left behind. The confession hung in the air like smoke, and for a moment the anger in the crowd wavered. But Marcus wasn't done. He stepped closer to the gate, his face twisted with something that looked less like rage and more like pain he'd been carrying for years that had nothing to do with Simone. My father used to beat my mother, he said, his voice breaking. Every night after he'd been drinking, he'd come home and take out whatever demons he had on her. And you know what she did? She stayed. She stayed because she loved him, because she believed in him, because she thought she could save him. And when I was 13, he put her in the hospital so bad she never fully recovered. So when you talk about feeling empty, about looking for something real, I've been looking for that my whole life too, Simone. And I thought maybe, just maybe, you could be that for me. But you couldn't even try. The vulnerability in his confession shocked everyone, including Marcus himself. The mob behind him shifted uncomfortably, some of them looking away, some of them suddenly seeing their leader as human instead of hero. Simone felt something crack open in her chest. Not attraction, not forgiveness, but recognition. They were all broken. They were all searching. They were all trying to fill voids that other people couldn't fill because that wasn't how healing worked. I couldn't save you, Marcus, Simone said quietly, just like these other men couldn't save me. Because we're all looking for someone else to fix what's broken inside us instead of doing the hard work ourselves. She held up her mother's letter. My mama died when I was 7, and my daddy spent the rest of his life running from that pain. He gave me everything except himself because facing me meant facing his grief. And I've been doing the same thing, running through men, through money, through anything that might fill the emptiness for 5 minutes. But it doesn't work. It never works. And tomorrow night, I'm going to a grief support group because a man I barely know cared enough to tell me the truth, that what I'm looking for isn't in anybody's bed. It's in facing the pain I've been running from my entire life. The silence that followed was deafening. Some of the men in the crowd looked ashamed. Some looked angry. Some just looked tired of carrying pain they'd never learned to name. Marcus lowered a megaphone, his shoulders sagging. So what are you saying? That we're all just broken people hurting each other? Simone nodded. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And maybe if we stopped trying to find salvation in each other and started finding it in ourselves, we'd stop destroying everyone we touch. But not everyone in the crowd was moved by Simone's honesty. A man named Tell, who'd never even dated Simone but resented everything she represented, pushed through to the front. This is bullshit, he yelled. You think a sob story about your dead mama excuses how you've treated people? You think going to one support group makes you a good person? He pulled out his phone and held it up. I've been recording this whole thing, and I'm posting it everywhere. Let the world see the billionaire's daughter trying to play victim when she's the one who's been victimizing this whole town. Before Simone could respond, he hit upload. Within minutes, the video was spreading across social media, but not with the reaction Tell expected. The comments weren't all condemning Simone. Many were sympathizing with her honesty. Some were calling out the mob for harassing a woman at her home. Others were sharing their own stories of grief and pain and the impossible standards we hold each other to when we're all just trying to survive our trauma. The narrative was shifting, and Tell's attempt to destroy Simone was backfiring. But in Pinewood itself, lines were being drawn. Some people stood with Simone. Others stood with the Brotherhood. And as the crowd finally dispersed from her gates, Simone walked back to her porch, picked up her mother's letters, and made a decision. Tomorrow night, she would go to that support group. She would face her pain, and she would stop letting this town define her worth. But as she turned to go inside, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think you won tonight? This isn't over. We're going to expose every dirty secret about your father's business and how he really made his money. By the time we're done, you'll wish you'd left town when you had the chance." The war for Simone's soul and Pinewood's conscience had only just begun. The next morning, Simone woke up to her mansion being vandalized. Someone had spray-painted "Gold Digger Destroys Black Men" across her front gates in red letters that looked like blood in the early morning light. Her Mercedes had been keyed so deeply the metal showed through the candy red paint, and someone had thrown eggs at every window facing the street. But worse than the physical damage was what she found when she checked her email. Dozens of messages from lawyers, journalists, and activists, all asking the same question. Is it true your father built his fortune by exploiting black workers and using predatory lending practices in black communities? Attached to many of these emails were documents, contracts, loan agreements, legal complaints, that painted Robert Montgomery not as a successful businessman Simone had believed him to be, but as someone who'd gotten rich by taking advantage of the very community he claimed to uplift. Simone's hand shook as she read through the evidence, each page destroying another piece of the father she thought she knew. If you think this story has reached its peak, you haven't seen anything yet. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because what gets revealed in this chapter will shock you to your core, and the confrontation that's coming will leave you breathless. Simone called Gerald Hutchinson at 6 a.m, not caring that she was waking him up, not caring about anything except the truth. "Did you know?" she demanded the moment he answered. "Did you know my father was a predator?" Gerald's silence on the other end told her everything. "Simone, it's complicated. Don't you dare tell me it's complicated," she screamed into the phone. "I have documents here showing my father gave loans to black families with interest rates that should be illegal, that he foreclosed on homes when people were just one payment behind, that he bought properties for pennies and flipped them for fortunes while the original owners lost everything. How is that complicated, Mr. Hutchinson? That's exploitation. That's evil." Gerald sighed heavily, and when he spoke, he sounded like a man who'd been carrying a terrible secret for too long. "Your father wasn't always like that, baby girl. When he and your mother first started the business, they wanted to help people. They gave fair loans. They worked with families who struggled. They built affordable housing. But after your mother died, something broke in Robert. He became obsessed with building wealth, with never being vulnerable again, with creating a fortress of money that grief couldn't penetrate. And yes, he crossed lines. He did things that hurt people. But he also donated millions to schools, churches, and community programs. He was both things, good and bad, generous and greedy, loving and destructive." The revelation hit Simone like a physical blow. Everything she believed about her father, everything she defended him for, everything she'd used his money to buy, all of it was built on other people's pain. The mansion she lived in, the car that got keyed, the designer clothes in her closet, all purchased with money extracted from families who looked like her, who struggled like her, who'd lost things they could never get back just so Robert Montgomery could avoid feeling the emptiness his wife's death had left behind. Simone thought about the men she'd hurt, the town she'd alienated, the reputation she'd destroyed, and realized she was her father's daughter in ways she'd never wanted to admit. She'd used people to avoid her pain just like he had. She'd built walls of wealth and beauty and attitude to keep grief at bay just like he had. And now, just like him, she was facing the consequences of running from what hurt instead of healing it. "What do I do?" she whispered into the phone. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. "You do what your father never could. Simone, you face it. You own it. You make it right." That evening, Simone didn't just go to the grief support group Isaiah had invited her to. She went with a plan that would either redeem her or destroy her completely. The community center where the grief support group met was nothing like the spaces Simone usually occupied. The building was old, with cracked linoleum floors and fluorescent lights that flickered. Folding chairs arranged in a circle held about 15 people, black folks of all ages who'd lost parents, siblings, children, spouses. When Simone walked in wearing jeans and a simple T-shirt instead of designer clothes, every head turned. The whispers started immediately, but Isaiah stood up from his seat and gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Glad you came," he said simply. Simone sat down, feeling more exposed than she'd ever felt in any bedroom with any man. The group leader, an older woman named Sister Pearl who'd lost her son to police violence 10 years ago, looked at Simone with eyes that saw everything. "We don't care who you are outside these walls," Sister Pearl said. "In here, we're all equal in our pain. You want to share, you share. You want to listen, you listen. But you leave your armor at the door." For the next hour, Simone listened to stories that broke her heart. A mother who'd lost a teenage daughter to a drunk driver, a man who'd watched his brother die of cancer, a young woman whose father had been killed in a robbery. Each story was different, but the pain underneath was the same. The emptiness, the anger, the desperate search for something to fill the void that grief carved into your soul. And when it was Simone's turn to speak, she didn't talk about her father's money or her reputation or the men she'd hurt. She talked about being 7 years old and watching her mother die, about her father disappearing into work and leaving her alone in a mansion full of everything except love. "I've been trying to fill that emptiness with men who couldn't fill it," Simone said, tears streaming down her face. "And I hurt them because they couldn't give me what I needed, but what I needed wasn't theirs to give. It was mine to face." The group listened without judgment, and when she finished, several people nodded with understanding that came from living through their own versions of her story. But then Simone took a breath and did something that would change everything. "There's something else I need to say. Something I need this community to know." She pulled out her phone and opened the documents about her father's business practices. "My father built his fortune by exploiting black families in this town and others like it. He gave predatory loans. He foreclosed on homes. He took advantage of people's desperation. And I've been living off that money without questioning where it came from." The room went silent. Isaiah's eyes widened. Sister Pearl leaned forward. "I don't want that money," Simone continued. "I don't want to live in a mansion built on other people's suffering. So I'm making an announcement tomorrow. I'm establishing a reparations fund with my entire inheritance. Every family my father hurt, every home he foreclosed on, every loan that destroyed someone's life, I'm making it right. I'm giving it all back." The room erupted. Some people gasped. Some people cried. Isaiah reached over and squeezed a hand. But outside the community center, Tell and 3 members of the Pinewood Brotherhood had been listening at the window, and they had very different plans for Simone's money. As the support group ended and people filtered out into the parking lot, Tell stepped out of the shadows with a recording device in his hand and a smile that promised destruction. "That's a real noble gesture, Miss Montgomery," he said. "Real noble. But see, we've been doing some research too. And we found something interesting. Your father didn't just exploit black families. He also had a whole other family in Atlanta. A wife and 2 kids he supported for 15 years before he died, which means you're not even his only heir. Which means that money you're trying to give away, it's not even fully yours to give." Simone felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Another family, another lie, another betrayal from beyond the grave. How much more could one man's secrets destroy? Simone should have crumbled right there in the parking lot under the weight of yet another devastating revelation about the man who'd raised her while hiding entire lives from her view. But something had shifted inside her during that hour in the support group, listening to people who'd survived losses that would have destroyed weaker souls. She looked at Tell with eyes that no longer held shame or fear, only a clarity that came from finally understanding that her father's sins didn't have to define her future. "You're right," she said calmly, and the admission clearly surprised him. "If my father had another family, they deserve their share of everything he left behind. In fact, they deserve more than a share. They deserve the truth, an apology, and whatever healing I can help provide." Tell's smug expression faltered. This wasn't the reaction he'd wanted. He'd wanted tears, wanted begging, wanted the satisfaction of watching the billionaire's daughter finally break completely. "You can't just—" he started, but Simone cut him off. "I can, and I will. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling a town meeting at the community center. I'm inviting my father's other family if they exist. I'm inviting everyone he hurt. And I'm going to tell the complete truth about Robert Montgomery, his business practices, his secret life, and how I plan to make reparations not just with money, but with transparency and accountability. If you've been on this emotional journey with us, don't click away now, because this final chapter is where everything comes together in ways you never expected. Hit that like button and stay until the very end, because Simone's story is about to teach us all what real redemption looks like. The town meeting the next morning was packed with more people than the community center had ever held. News crews from Atlanta had driven down after the viral video. Activists had arrived to support or protest, and it seemed like every resident of Pinewood had shown up to witness what would happen next. Simone stood at the front of the room. No makeup, no designer clothes, just a woman ready to face the complete truth of her inheritance. Gerald Hutchinson sat in the front row looking 10 years older than he had a week ago. Isaiah sat beside Sister Poe, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaos. Marcus and several members of the Pinewood Brotherhood stood in the back, arms crossed, waiting to see if this was real or just another performance. And in the second row sat 3 people Simone had never met, a woman about her father's age named Patricia, and 2 young adults, a man and a woman in their 20s, who had Robert Montgomery's eyes and Simone's cheekbones. Her half-siblings, her father's other life made flesh. "My name is Simone Montgomery," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And I'm the daughter of a man who hurt a lot of people in this community, including me, including his other family that I just learned about yesterday, including everyone who trusted him to be better than he was." For the next hour, Simone told a complete story, not a sanitized version, not a defensive justification, but the raw truth. She read from the documents showing her father's predatory lending practices, the families he'd foreclosed on, the wealth he'd accumulated by exploiting desperation. She shared what Gerald had told her about how grief had twisted her father from a man who wanted to help into a man who used others' pain to avoid his own. She read passages from her mother's letters that talk about the kind of man Robert had been before loss changed him, and how her mother had worried that without her, he'd lose his way completely. "My mother was right," Simone said, tears streaming down her face. "My father did lose his way. And in losing his way, he hurt countless people. But here's what I'm learning. We can't change the past, but we can change what we do with the inheritance it leaves us." She turned to face Patricia and her half-siblings. "I'm sorry," she said directly to them. "I'm sorry my father betrayed your mother, betrayed you, lived a double life that denied you the recognition you deserved. I'm sorry I grew up in a mansion while you struggled. I'm sorry for all of it. And I want to split everything, the estate, the properties, the money, equally with you, if you'll accept it." Patricia stood slowly, and the room held its breath. She was a beautiful woman with gray threading through her natural hair and eyes that held both pain and dignity. "Your father supported us financially," she said quietly, "but he never gave us his name. He never claimed my children publicly. He visited once a month like we were a side project, not a family. So yes, we'll accept what's owed to us. But money doesn't heal what your father broke." "You're right," Simone agreed. "Money doesn't heal anything, which is why I'm doing more than just splitting the inheritance." She turned to address the entire room. "I'm establishing the Montgomery Reparations and Healing Fund with my portion of my father's estate. Every family that lost a home to his foreclosures will receive compensation and an opportunity to reclaim their property if they choose. Every person who paid predatory interest rates will be refunded the excess. Every community organization my father should have supported but didn't will receive endowments. But more than that, I'm funding mental health services, grief counseling, and community healing circles, because what this town needs isn't just money. It's a chance to heal from generations of trauma, exploitation, and pain that people like my father perpetuated." The room erupted in a mixture of applause, crying, and shocked silence. But then Marcus stood up from the back, and everyone quieted to hear what the man who'd led the charge against Simone would say. "I came here today wanting to watch you suffer," he admitted, his voice raw. "I wanted revenge for how you made me feel. But listening to you now, I realize I was trying to make you responsible for healing wounds you didn't create, wounds my father left, wounds this world left, Wounds I've been carrying so long I forgot they weren't originally mine. He looked around at the other men from the Brotherhood. We all were. We wanted the Billionaire's daughter to satisfy something in us that nobody can satisfy for anybody else. That's not on her. That's on us to heal. He walked down the aisle and stopped in front of Simone. I'm sorry for leading that mob to your house. I'm sorry for trying to destroy you. And I hope you can forgive me someday, even though I don't deserve it. Simone looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and saw not the man who'd screamed at her in a diner or led a mob to her gates, but a hurt person trying to heal, just like she was. I forgive you, she said simply, and I hope you can forgive me for using you to avoid my own pain. What happened next would be talked about in Pinewood for generations. One by one, men who'd dated Simone and felt rejected stood up and apologized. Women who'd gossiped about her admitted their own judgments came from jealousy and insecurity. Business owners who'd profited from Robert Montgomery's exploitation pledged to make their own reparations. The community center became a space of collective confession, collective grief, and collective healing. It wasn't perfect. Some people left angry. Some refused to participate. Some still believed Simone was performing rather than transforming. But something fundamental had shifted in Pinewood that morning. 3 months later, Simone stood in the kitchen of a modest house she bought on the same street where Isaiah lived, cooking dinner for the grief support group that now met weekly at her place. She'd sold the mansion and most of her designer clothes. She'd split her father's estate with Patricia and her half-siblings, who were slowly building a relationship with her that was cautious but genuine. She'd established the reparations fund and hired a team of community organizers to manage the healing work. And she'd started volunteering at a women's shelter, using her story to help other women understand that satisfying the urge they felt wasn't about finding the right man. It was about finding themselves. Isaiah walked into the kitchen carrying groceries, and Simone smiled at him, not the practiced smile she'd used to hide behind, but a real one that came from actually being happy. They'd been dating for 2 months, taking it slow, building friendship before romance, learning each other's wounds before trying to heal them. You know what's funny? Simone said as she stirred the pot on the stove. For years, people said no man in this entire town could satisfy me. And they were right. But not because the men weren't enough. Because what I was hungry for wasn't something any man could give me. I had to find it myself. Isaiah wrapped his arms around her waist and kissed her temple. And did you? Find it. Simone thought about the question, really thought about it. She thought about the grief group that had become her family, the reparations work that gave her purpose, the relationship with her half-siblings that was teaching her about forgiveness, the therapy she was doing to heal childhood wounds, the life she was building that wasn't about running from pain but learning to live with it, through it, beyond it. Yeah, she said softly. I think I finally did. And it turns out, once you stop looking for someone else to fill you up, you discover you were whole along. You just couldn't see it through all the emptiness. That evening, as the grief support group gathered in her living room, sharing food and stories and laughter that came from surviving things that should have destroyed them, Simone understood something profound. The billionaire's daughter's urge was never about sex or satisfaction in the way Pinewood had judged it. It was about the universal human hunger to be seen, to be known, to matter to someone, to heal the wounds that life inevitably leaves on every heart. And the only person who could truly satisfy that urge was the one looking back at her in the mirror, finally whole, finally healing, finally free. If this story touched you, please share it, comment below, and subscribe for more powerful stories about healing, redemption, and finding yourself when the world tries to tell you who you should be. Remember, you are not your worst mistakes, you are not other people's judgments, and you are never too broken to begin again. Thank you for taking this journey with Simone. Now go begin your own.